Chapter 5 of Dr. John Dee, Elizabethan Mystic and Astrologer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. The Christmas of 1589 saw Dee back in his own house at Mortlake. A few days previously he had been graciously received by Elizabeth in audience at Richmond, and the bitter memory of his humiliating experiences must have been somewhat softened by her kindness, and by that of friends like Adrian Gilbert, who came at once to visit him and to offer him help. But his financial situation was sufficiently alarming. He had lost, through his own carelessness of not arranging for their payment to him when abroad, the small revenues from his lay rectorships. Many of his most valuable books and instruments had been destroyed in the mob's attack on his house, and there was very naturally no sign of the promised supplies from Bohemia. All his children were still young, and a few months after the return to Mortlake, another daughter was born. Bestirring himself again in the quest for preferments, Dee asked, as he had asked many years before, for the mastership of the Hospital of Holy Cross, Winchester. But though influential persons interested themselves on his behalf, the matter, like many other, came to nothing. Full and free permission from Elizabeth to continue his alchemical experiments without hindrance from the laws in force against magic was, however, a consolation of sorts. He still believed that Kelly, with whom he had some correspondence, might eventually return, or failing that he himself might discover the great secret of transmutation by his own efforts. He gave himself earnestly to his old studies, in which the Queen still took some gracious interest, and no doubt he also earned something by the drawing of horoscopes and other astrological work. But it was a painful struggle. As he himself says, he was stinted in food and clothing, devoured by usurers, and daily put to shame. At last, towards the end of 1592, the Queen, in response to his desperate petition, sent to Mortlake two commissioners, Sir John Woolley and Sir Thomas Gorges, to hear his statement of affairs and to report to her. Dee drew up for them that lengthy autobiographical statement known to us as the Compendious Rehearsal, and as he read it to them in his library at Mortlake, we may well believe that his voice often faltered with emotion and the sense of what he had suffered. He who had given his life to the pursuit of knowledge, who had ever met all truth, sincerity, fidelity, and piety to God, Queen, and country, saw himself in advancing age without provision for today or prospect for tomorrow. Yet, as he said, there was a very easy remedy for his lamentable case. The Queen could bestow on him some office with due maintenance attached. The Queen did immediately send him 100 marks, and though preferment still hung fire, there is evidence that the ecclesiastical prejudice against the spiritualistic philosopher was not quite such a barrier to it as formerly. Archbishop Whitgift showed him some respect and kindliness, and at length, through his good offices, Dee was recommended to the wardenship of Christ's College, Manchester, and actually obtained it. The Manchester of Tudor times was already one of the most thriving and populous of English provincial towns, or, as they were then commonly called, villages. Thanks to the Flemish weavers who settled there in the reign of Edward III, it boasted a busy trade, a cloth mill, and a market. The college, a pre-Reformation foundation which had provided priests and other spiritual necessities for the growing town, had been recently granted a new charter, with a warden, 4 fellows, 2 chaplains, and choristers. It seemed likely to provide a congenial retreat for a man of learning, and Dee took the long journey northward in a mood of gratitude and hope, though it must have been somewhat of a wrench to leave Mortlake, where, since the return to England, 3 little daughters had successfully been born to him, and Michael, the son born at Prague, had died of some childish illness. The old house, too, was full of memories of Kelly and the crystal gazing. Dee may well have felt that he was leaving much of his real life behind him in the grave of those 4 walls, which indeed is very much our feeling also. As warden of Manchester College, Dee seems little more than a shadow of his true self. That tall, slender figure in the scholar's loose-sleeved gown seems grotesquely out of place, with the busy Lancashire village for a background. Soon he himself was complaining bitterly of the continual interruptions to his beloved studies by the cares and cumbers of this defaced and disordered college, which had not even gained him freedom from money troubles, but, on the contrary, involved him in money troubles of its own. The revenues had sadly shrunk and were, through the continual disputes over tithes and lands, still shrinking. The warden was still supposed to be in priest's orders, and Dee, as a layman, had to pay curates to fulfill such priestly duties as had survived to Anglican times. And in the society into which he was now thrown there was little demand for the gifts which he esteemed above all others, and found his greatest happiness in using. The sleepy post-medieval college and the expanding township were both of them provincial in their own way. Both had their own narrow bigotry. The new warden received some odd tributes to his occult learning. We hear of him as lending books on demonology out of his library to puzzled justices to assist them in examining and sentencing supposed witches, and as being consulted about a case of possession in which one Hartley, a conjurer, had made himself notorious. Dee's curate, the Reverend Matthew Palmer, denounced as imposture Hartley's attempts to cast the evil spirits out of a poor woman and her children, who were grievously troubled with fits, and Dee himself sent for Hartley and sharply rebuked him, with the result, we are given to understand, of a temporary improvement. Dee, however, did not himself attempt the act of exorcism, but left it to a godly preacher. Probably his medical knowledge told him that epilepsy and not Satan was at the root of the trouble. With popular superstition and ignorance, he had never had more sympathy than the majority of learned men. The struggle to live went on. The fellows of the college do not seem to have been on very good terms with their warden, and there were continual disputes with them and with the tenants of the college lands. The warden, however, did a little farming of his own land, and visits from friends from London, as well as a lengthy stay he himself made in London to transact college business, varied the monotony of the provincial years. The happenings of this later period are not narrated with the old fullness in his diary, but we get occasional glimpses of his inner life. Still he records dreams which may possibly prove prophetic. Still he meditates on occult works, which he yet means to write, and on the triumph that may yet crown his alchemical researches. We know also that he had occasional resort to the crystal, sometimes with the aid of a Mr. Francis Nichols, who had been one of his astrological pupils at Mortlake, sometimes with Bartholomew Hickman, the son of an old acquaintance, whose mediumistic powers Dee had apparently detected years ago, when Bartholomew was a lad in his father's house. So the years drifted on. Theodore, the boy born at Trebona, followed Michael to an early grave, but the other young Dees were growing up. Sometime in 1602, Arthur, the child once consecrated as Scryer, who in later life studied and practiced medicine, and became the close friend at Norwich to Sir Thomas Browne, married the daughter of a Manchester Justice of the Peace, and Dee had the horoscopes of the young grandchildren to draw. Arthur seems to have been an affectionate and dutiful son, and of great comfort to the old scholar in the still darker times that was to follow on this interval of peace. The spring of 1603 saw the death of Elizabeth, and with her died all hope of further preferment. Indeed, Dee seems to have believed his life in actual danger from the new act against witchcraft, and the horrible zeal with which James and his advisers administered it. He drew up impassioned petitions to the king to be cleared of the infamous slanders that represented him as the conjurer and caller of devils. They went unregarded, but there was no definite attempt to molest him. It may even be that James felt a certain respect for him or feared his mysterious powers. There is a story, though not a very well authenticated one, that Dee or Kelly had foreseen in the crystal the gunpowder plot, the faces of the traitors, and the intended fate of the king and Parliament. At any rate, the new government seemed content to leave the old man to die in peace. One sharp and crowning sorrow was to follow. In the spring following Elizabeth's death, the plague came to Manchester. Perhaps, as Miss Fell-Smith conjectures, some of her children were also victims. At least we do not again hear anything of the three younger girls. Catherine, the eldest, survived to minister tenderly to the stricken man, round whom the mortal shadows were thickening, whose long life, vulgarly supposed to be one of the results of alchemical skill, was fast drawing to its close. But there was to be light at eventide. With every possible door of worldly advantage closed, and with even the Manchester wardenship perforce resigned through broken health and increasing infirmities, the old hope of intercourse with the invisible was rekindled. About a year after Elizabeth's death, while Dee lay ill in London, there came to his scryer, Bartholomew Hickman, a sight of God's blessed creature, Raphael, the angel of healing, and Dee received comfort and reassurance about his physical state. In the summer of the same year, when the old man, with his daughter, was lodging in an inn at Westminster, the vision came again, bringing this time a more definite message of health and vigor restored, and of a long journey to friends beyond the sea, where all that Dee had so long desired to know should be made plain to him. The secrets of transmutation, and greater secrets still. True to his old careful habit, Dee had many questions to ask about the manner and companions of that journey. His weakening mind is still occupied with many trifling details, yet at the last all doubts and troubles seem of a sudden to be resolved. At Raphael's bidding, he renounces his anxiety about the moneys that he should have received from the Emperor Rudolph. The Emperor of all emperors will be thy comfort. Thou hast no more need of Rudolph, says the angelic voice. It has been well observed that in these last seances it is the voice, not the appearance of the messenger, of which we hear most. In earlier years, Dee, who could neither see nor scry, was troubled at his limitations, and resorted eagerly to clairvoyance to transcend them. He had never really quite believed that the vision of faith and imagination was perfecter than Kelly's gift of seership. Now it is his own psychic powers that seem summoned and aroused. The subjective has become of more importance than the objective. He sees with the soul. The words of Raphael were not long in fulfillment. Dee had truly no more need of Rudolph, nor of any earthly thing, and in December 1603 the long journey, beyond the seas of time, was indeed taken. It is pleasant to think that the love and care of a faithful little circle, of his son and daughter, of Bartholomew Hickman and another disciple, John Pontoise, surrounded him to the last, and that death came to him at quiet Mortlake, where, in spite of all the slanders, his memory was not unhonored by the village folk, one of whom spoke of him to his kinsman Aubrey as the great peacemaker among quarrelsome neighbors, and as a mighty good man. We have spoken of the injury inflicted on Dee's posthumous reputation by popular prejudice and ignorance. Perhaps also occultists and mystics themselves are inclined to give him less than is due. He so often fell short of his lofty aims, and it is easy to forget how lofty those aims in truth were, and how his very failures were in part the failures of one whose vision was beyond that of his age. His very knowledge and eager, speculative mind often proved a hindrance to practical attainments. It has been said that Dee was a spiritualist rather than an occultist, but even so he brought to his spiritualism some high, far-reaching thoughts from his occult studies. He investigated spiritualism as an astrologer who had not forgotten the nobler lessons of his art, and his belief in the might of stars and angels saved him from too blind a belief in the wisdom of the spirits of the earthbound dead. His own words to Kelly, aforequoted, are his own best apologia. It was in truth the company and information of the angels of God that he sought, and if he did not always take the best means to attain it, his desire, that infinite desire, which a great mystic has described as more pleasing to God than any finished work, burned high and true to the last. In an age at once superstitiously credulous and superstitiously skeptical, he upheld the great tradition that human nature itself contains the germs of supernormal faculties which, rightly understood and developed, may establish a real communication with the spiritual world. We may say with some justice that he himself did not use those faculties to any great profit, but he passed on the torch. Modern psychical research owes something to his memory. End of Chapter 5. End of Dr. John Dee, Elizabethan Mystic and Astrologer, by G.M. Hort.